This brief lesson will be a wrap-up for the Cold War chapter. It's entitled Section 5 of Chapter 33. It's going to wrap up pretty much how the Cold War comes into a state of thawing out. And that's going to be with Soviet policy and Nikita Khrushchev, and then some of the actions by countries that were trying to separate from the Soviets. And then, of course, a little bit of Ronald Reagan getting involved as well. So the Soviet policy in Eastern Europe and China began to change. There was something called the de-Stalinization and protests that went on in the Soviet Union. This is under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. He was the leader of the Soviets after the death of Stalin in 1953. He actually wanted to purge Russia of Stalin's memory, which was known as de-Stalinization. He condemned Stalin and declared that the Soviets and the West could compete peacefully. Citizens of the Soviet-controlled governments began to protest communism. Khrushchev sent in the Soviet military, for example, to put down Hungarian protesters in one of those clashes. The revolt also in Czechoslovakia was one that they had to deal with. Leonid Brezhnev became the Soviet leader after Khrushchev, and he repressed dissidents, which were people speaking out against communist government, and limited basic human rights. In 1968, the Warsaw Pact troops blocked reforms in Czechoslovakia, and then the Soviets and the Chinese split. So you had uprisings in Hungary, uprisings in Czechoslovakia, and then the Soviets and the Chinese would split. In 1950, Mao and Stalin had signed a friendship treaty, but friendship remained between the two groups, the Chinese and the Soviets. Each wanted to lead the world communist movement, and Khrushchev ended economic aid and refused to share nuclear secrets to China. The Soviets and China had a few small skirmishes across their borderlines, and that sort of broke down their relationships. In the West, it moved from brinkmanship to detente. Brinkmanship would eventually break down. Nuclear war was still a constant threat. I mean, in the United States, they had videos like Duck and Cover, where they'd have, kind of like Looney Tunes style cartoons in black and white, where you'd have a turtle who would duck underneath his desk at school and get into his shell. And they would show these to children in schools. Even when I was a kid, we would practice, duck and cover, getting under your desk and getting yourself into like a turtle shell, covering your head with your forearms and trying to get underneath tables or getting as close to like foundational walls that were strong that you possibly could. So these were things that were going on during the Cold War. John F. Kennedy was the United States president during the Cuban Missile Crisis that we learned about in this chapter. And then Lyndon Johnson was the president that actually increased United States involvement in Vietnam. The United States turns to what's called detente. This was at a Vietnam-era turmoil fueled by desire for less confrontational policies. Detente was a policy of reducing Cold War tensions and trying to actually avoid actual conflict. Richard Nixon was the U.S. president who launched this movement known as detente. Detente grows out of a philosophy known as realpolitik. Hopefully you remember who developed this. Way back in Prussia, it was Otto von Bismarck. Not the best guy overall, but he did develop what's known as realpolitik. These are realistic politics that recognize the need to be practical and flexible. Nixon, though, did visit communist powers. Nixon visited the communist China and the Soviet Union, and out of these meetings, there was a treaty signed called SALT I. SALT means Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. The goal of all of this was to limit nuclear weapons. And then Roman numeral III talks about the collapse of detente. Policy would change under President Nixon and President Gerald Ford. The relations with the Soviets and China improved. And you have Jimmy Carter coming into play. He had concerns about Soviet policies, but still signed SALT number 2. Now, U.S. Congress did not ratify SALT II due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we learned about in the previous section. Now, Ronald Reagan took a very strong anti-communist stance. He became president of the United States in 1981, and he was an anti-communist. He increased military spending and proposed a popular missile defense program, which was known as Star Wars. In 1985, new Soviet leadership allowed for the easing of Cold War tension as well. Basically, the Star Wars was kind of an interesting ploy by Ronald Reagan. It's basically the idea that he would tout that we had technology to shoot down nuclear missiles from a satellite in space. Now, it's really unknown if we actually had that technology, but most historical writers will say that we probably didn't and still probably do not have that technology today. I want to show you something real quick that's probably for a lot of my students something that you'll be surprised to see. But, you know, Donald Trump, the previous president at this current time, we have Joe Biden in office right now. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan made a political button with this theme: let's make America great again. And that was what Donald Trump sort of run off. So it's kind of interesting. Like, that wasn't something totally new, guys. That was something Trump basically copied from Ron Reagan. Okay, thank you. That wraps up chapter 33 on the Cold War.